Welcome back to Toward a More Jewish Jesus. One of the things that we try to do here is to change people's minds, to help people reframe the way they see Jews, Gentiles, and Jesus. And we try to equip people also by providing resources. And one of the resources I want to discuss with you today is a book that I've read that really astounded me, delighted me, stimulated me, contradicted me, but a book that I did not want to avoid, and I should not have. Great book to read. It's called The Misunderstood Jew, The Church and the Scandal of the Jewish Jesus by Dr. Amy Jill-Levine. Dr. Amy Jill-Levine is an interesting person. She teaches New Testament at the Vanderbilt Divinity School in Nashville, Tennessee. She's the professor of New Testament studies there, and she happens to be an Orthodox Jew, which you might find rather unusual, and it is. I know of a few scholars here in America who are professors of New Testament studies who are religious Jews, and she's one of them. She grew up in Dorchester, Massachusetts, in an area like I grew up in. And I often tell people where I grew up, the Protestant Reformation had not occurred yet, because there were no Protestants. There were Jews and there were Catholics. To be fair, there were two kinds of Catholics. There were Irish Catholics and Italian Catholics, and then the rest of us were Jews. She grew up in Massachusetts in a similar situation in a mixed neighborhood, and her parents were very secure in their Jewishness, so they let her have contact with her Catholic friends, and it wasn't until she was, I think, in her senior year in high school that she first cracked open the New Testament, and she found some texts in there that disturbed her, and she had to balance this against the fact that she had very good relationships with her Christian friends, but she read some things in the New Testament that unsettled her as a Jew, and she wanted to resolve the dissonance. And she has positioned herself as something of a peacemaker between these two communities, the Christian world and the Jewish world. And she believes that the pathway to peace between these two worlds is to see Yeshua, to see Jesus in his Jewish context. That's very much what we do here. The Apostle Paul said of Yeshua, he himself is our peace. And that was in the letter to the Ephesians, chapter 2, verse 14, for those of you who care about such things. And he was not talking about peace with God, vertical peace. He was talking about horizontal peace, peace between the pagan world and the Jewish world that had always looked at each other as opposites and as antagonists. And he said that Yeshua, Jesus himself, makes peace between these two warring worlds. And it's still true. The Christian world and the Jewish world have for thousands of years tended to define themselves in contradistinction to each other. But when you have a more Jewish Jesus, you discover there are extraordinary areas of commonality that have never been explored. And we here at Interfaithfulness, that produces this podcast, Toward a More Jewish Jesus, we want to help people explore this. And one of the ways to help you explore these things, and I know some of you are getting very interested because it scratches your own itches, I want to recommend, among other books that we'll discuss on this program, this one, The Misunderstood Jew, The Church and the Scandal of the Jewish Jesus by Amy Jill-Levine. I want to talk a little bit about her book today in order to introduce her to you and what she says to you. As I said, she lives for the idea that the pathway to peace between the Christian and Jewish worlds is a more Jewish Jesus. And this reminds me of Dr. Colin Brown. Dr. Colin Brown is a systematic theologian. He's what's called a polymath. A polymath is someone who has world-class expertise in a variety of areas. A number of years ago, he was asked by a publishing company to single-handedly write a history of Western civilization. Now, I don't know if you know anybody that's capable of doing that. Dr. Brown is and was, he must be in his 90s now. He lives down the street from me. And I ran into him in a bookstore a few years ago. And I was discussing things of mutual interest. And he told me something that really astounded me. He said, the church has not forgotten that Jesus was a Jew. The church suppressed it. Now, if I say that to you, it's one thing. If Joe Schmo down the block says it to you, it's another thing. If your rabbi or your pastor says it, it's another thing. But if a man who, for example, taught systematic theology at Fuller Seminary for 47 years, and who is one of the great historical theologians and systematic theologians of the last 100 years, when he says that, it makes you sit up and take notice. It did that with me. And Dr. Levine says that the church had to de-Judaize Jesus in order to position him against Judaism. Now, you may wonder, why did they want to position Jesus against Judaism? I'll get to that. But, you got to remember that, as we've been saying here, Jesus' Jewishness is not some kind of superficial veneer. It's bone of his bone and flesh of his flesh. In John chapter 4, when he meets the Samaritan woman at a well, she is a person who theologically and demographically is looked upon as damaged goods to most religious Jews of her day, because they were a group that was looked upon as cultic and as hostile to the Jewish people. And he sits down at a well. This Samaritan woman comes, and he asks her for a drink of water, and she says to him, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask a drink of me, who is a Samaritan woman?" So she recognized him as a Jew. And later on in the discussion, they're having an interreligious discussion, and he says to her, "You don't know what you worship. You Samaritans don't know, but we know what we worship, for salvation is from the Jews." He positions himself as part of the Jewish we. But the church has suppressed this, and as Dr. Levine says, the church has de-Judaized Jesus in order to position him against Judaism. And I'm reading a brief quote from her. Listen to this. She said, "Jesus' connections to the basic Jewish teachings were right on target, and his connections to Judaism can be seen not only in his general comments about Torah, but also in his practice of its commandments." In other words, Jesus was Jewish not just genetically. He was Jewish conceptually. He was Jewish behaviorally. And people are surprised. In the New Testament, one of Jesus' principal disciples was Peter. And some years after the resurrection, Peter has a vision in which he sees a sheet lowered down from heaven, and a voice says, "Arise, Peter, kill and eat." And in this sheet are all kinds of creeping things and all kinds of animals and strange things that are not kosher. And he turns to God and he says, "Look, I'm not going to do that." He says, "I've never let anything unkosher or unclean pass my lips." This is years after the resurrection. And Peter is still an observant Jew. And by the way, that vision was not about food. That vision was about people. But we'll cover that some other time. But the point is that this Jewishness to the bone of Jewish bone, flesh of Jewish flesh, was true of Yeshua and also true of his disciples. So in her book, Dr. Levine takes issue with a famous author, Eric Klinghoffer, who wrote a book called "Why the Jews Rejected Jesus, the Turning Point in Western History." Klinghoffer has a very negative book about Jesus. And Amy Jill-Levine, who is an Orthodox Jew, she's not just Jewish, she's an Orthodox Jew. She takes issue with him. And let me read to you something of what she says, please. David Klinghoffer finds it unsurprising that some Jews of the time might have chosen to confront and debate with Jesus, since he, quote, "knowingly rejects the oral tradition, not from ignorance, but from willfulness," end quote. So Klinghoffer says that Jesus is an opponent of rabbinic Judaism. This is what Amy Jill-Levine says. The problem with this view is that the oral Torah itself is variable, and not all rabbis agreed with one another. So when Yeshua debates interpretations, he's not junking the oral Torah. He is doing a very Jewish thing. I read the other day, the Talmud is 6,200 pages of closely organized text. And it's all questions and issues and debates. And in the whole 6,200 pages of about 5,000 different debates, only 50 debates are really settled. The others are still ongoing discussion. So the idea that Yeshua junked Rabbinic Judaism simply because he had some questions to ask and some debates about interpretation is an ignorant statement. Frankly, that's what I would say. But let me get back to Amy Jill-Levine. She says this: even if one were to accept the highly disputed claim that the oral law eventually written down in the Mishnah close to 2 centuries after Jesus' death was fully in place in the time of Jesus, assuming that even though it was only written down 200 years later, it was still in the air in Jesus' day. She says that's highly debatable. That still does not mean that Jesus was out of step with his fellow Jews, including those with whom the rabbinic tradition would agree on most practices. In fact, there is no indication, this is what Dr. Levine says, that Jesus had a systematic interpretation of the Torah. Rather, the Gospel suggests that he responded to questions as they were posed by circumstances or by those seeking to learn from him or to test him. She continues, Jesus would have expected to be challenged and would have issued his own challenges, but that he was willing to engage in discussion of how to follow the commandments shows that he cared about them deeply. In his teaching, he shows an enormous respect for the mitzvot, the commandments, so much so that he debates how they are best to be understood and enacted. End quote. Now, I am sure that there are some of you who have been raised in a context that assumes that Yeshua discarded Jewish tradition and felt that it had outlived its usefulness. But Dr. Levine differs with you, as do I, and I respectfully say, as did Jesus. So let me get back to Dr. Levine. She makes another point. She says that Yeshua's parables are grossly misunderstood and used against the Jewish Jesus. They're grossly misunderstood by many contemporary people. Let me give you one example. There's a famous parable about the publican and the Pharisee. A publican is a tax collector. These tax collectors were people who competed for the privilege of collecting taxes from their fellow Jews. They would collect the taxes for the Roman occupying forces. And they would buy this concession to collect taxes. They would give the taxes to the Romans, but any extra money they collected, beyond what the Romans really wanted, was gravy. So they were ripping off their own people for the sake of the hated occupying forces and to feather their own nests. These people were utterly despised. And you can understand why. Well, Yeshua tells a parable about a publican, a tax collector, and a Pharisee who go up to the temple to pray. And the Pharisee says, I thank you, God, that I fast two times a week and that I'm not like this publican over here. And the publican does not even dare lift up his head to God. And he says, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. And Yeshua says that the publican went home justified. He went home okay with God. Now, what most people don't get from this story is that the Pharisee in the story is the hero. To Yeshua's listeners, the Pharisees were the religious superheroes. They were the Jews who were really serious about their Jewish observance. The fact that this man fasted twice a week was not a useless little doodad. It was an evidence of great dedication. And so this parable is meant to astonish us that even this publican who was in abject repentance and didn't even dare lift his head to God, it's astounding that he went home justified, because the good guy in the story is the Pharisee. Most people who've heard that parable think of the Pharisee as the bad guy. But no, the publican is the low-life traitor, and he is the person who everyone expected to get what he deserved, which was not forgiveness from God. But you can see how we bring our presuppositions into interpreting these passages. And I can't stand, for example, to listen to religious radio, to Christian radio. I can't stand it, because whenever the Jews are mentioned, whenever the Pharisees are mentioned, it's always as who you don't want to be when you grow up. The Pharisees are always the bad example. Well, that's not the way Jesus thought of things. That's not the way his contemporaries thought of things. They thought of the Pharisees as religiously serious people. And it was astounding that Yeshua had something to offer that the Pharisees did not recognize as being bona fide. That was astounding. So, let's go on. She makes a summational statement at the end of the first chapter that I wrote down because I wanted to share it with you. I continue to want to get you intrigued with Dr. Amy Jill-Levine's book, because it'll equip you. Although I will tell you, I don't agree with everything I read in it, not by a long shot. She doesn't believe in Yeshua. I do. She draws certain conclusions about Paul that I dispute, but even though I disagree with her, I love her mind, and so will you. But she says this: Jesus of Nazareth, dressed like a Jew, prayed like a Jew, and most likely in Aramaic, instructed other Jews on how best to live according to the commandments given by God to Moses. He talked like a Jew. He argued like a Jew with other Jews, and he died like thousands of other Jews on a Roman cross. To see him in a first century Jewish context and to listen to his words with first century ears do not in any way undermine Christian theological claims. Jesus does not have to be fully unique in order to say something or do something meaningful. So Yeshua can be meaningful without Judaism being meaningless. And I'm going to make this point in other ways because it's a big point to me and definitely to Dr. Amy Jill-Levine. She then goes on later in the book to discuss how and why Christianity separated Jesus from his Jewishness. And I thought you'd find this fascinating. So let me summarize a little bit what she says. First, I'll say this is not true of all Christian wings and of all Christian people. I don't think of Christians as the enemies of the Jewish community, God forbid. Nowadays, especially, there are many Christians who are avid supporters of Israel. They're avidly enthusiastic about a Jewish perspective on the Bible. Tomorrow night, as a matter of fact, I'm going to teach a group of Chinese Christians who just love to hear about the New Testament from a Jewish point of view. I teach them every month. So these are not Jews, but they're not enemies of the Jews. They're not antagonistic to a Jewish approach. They want to get as much of it as they can. There are many Christians like that. But historically, it's not always been that way, and there are still echoes of historical mistakes. Let me read you a little bit. The fundamental problem is seeking to lift up Jesus by putting down Judaism. The reflex is to make Jesus look good by making Judaism look bad. This happens. I see it happen. Right now on the internet it happens, and I challenge it every time. Happily, we're now aware that we need to seek to avoid doing this. But still, vestiges of this kind of attitude remain. Here at Interfaithfulness, we seek to expose this false assumption by presenting a more Jewish Jesus. We see him as still the son of David. We see him as Israel's defender and hero. He's not the leader of the opposition. He's the king of the Jews. You get that? He's not the leader of the opposition. He's the King of the Jews. He is our position, Jesus, not the opposition, Jesus. And when Christians and Jews see him this way, they can warm up to Jesus without growing cold to each other. Christians and Jews with a more Jewish Jesus can warm up to Jesus without growing cold to each other. I want to bring you something that she says towards the end of her 6th chapter, where she names 7 mischaracterizations of Jesus that have been perpetuated in Christianity too often. And I think you'll agree with these. And with this we'll close. Number 1, the view that Jewish law was impossible to follow, a burden no one could bear. A widespread view, this was especially stated years ago in a school of thought called dispensationalism, which tended to teach that, in a sense, obedience to the law was sucker bait. You couldn't really keep it, and yet people tried to keep it, and aren't they foolish? Well, this view that the law was impossible to follow is a strange view. Jews don't feel they have to get 100% score in order to be following the law. That's not the way it is. Secondly, the thesis that all Jews wanted a warrior Messiah who would defeat Rome, and therefore the Jews rejected Jesus because he sought to bring peace. That's an oversimplification that really is historically disproven. Thirdly, the proclamation that Jesus was a feminist in a woman-hating culture. It's another way in which some people try to discredit Judaism in order to lift up Jesus, that Jesus was a feminist, but Judaism was misogynist. Fourthly, the conclusion that Jews were obsessed with keeping himself pure from the contamination of outsiders, whereas Jesus broke through purity-based barriers. This makes, again, Judaism bad, Jesus good. That's a terrible way to do things. And it shows that you don't really understand Judaism. The insistence, number 5, that first century Judaism was marked by a temple-dominating system that oppressed the poor and women and promoted social division between insiders and outcasts. Now you see this in the movie The Passion of the Christ. The Passion of the Christ presents the people, the leaders in the temple, like a kind of a Jewish mafia that was spiritually devoid of anything to commend them. That they were an elitist group that made everyone else to be second class. The portrayal of Judaism in The Passion of the Christ is very offensive and not true. Number 6, the assertion that the Jews are narrow, clannish, particularistic, and xenophobic, fearful of strangers, and that Jesus and the church engaged in universal outreach. In other words, Jesus and the church love everybody. The Jews only love themselves. What a nice view. It's just groundless and pathetic. Finally, she says, the increasingly popular argument that the New Testament is not talking about Jews at all, but about Judeans, that we can like the Judeans, maybe, but they're not really Jews. The idea that being anti-Semitic today is not really true, because the Jews of Jesus' day were Judeans, and the Jews of today are looked upon as descendants from the Khazars, a group in Europe, and so they're not really Jews. So it's all right to hate them because they're not really Jews. Now, I know you probably don't know anybody who holds that view, but there's a book by the very reputable scholar Arthur Kiesler called The 13th Tribe, and that's what he says. And that's what anti-Semites still say. It's okay to hate the Jews because they're not really Jesus' kinsfolk. They're another group entirely. Well, all of this breeds tremendous animosity, tremendous dissonance. But here, at A More Jewish Jesus, we expect better things. And I hope you'll read Amy Jill-Levine's book, and that you'll join us in much purer space than these half-truths and attacks on the Jewish people. Come back to join us at Toward a More Jewish Jesus, where everything gets better when people move together toward a more Jewish Jesus. Shalom.
You may support our work at Toward a More Jewish Jesus by sending your tax-deductible contributions to Interfaithfulness, P.O. Box 6137, Altadena, California 91003, 6137. That's Interfaithfulness, P.O. Box 6137, Altadena, California 91003-6137. Please make out your checks to Interfaithfulness. If you prefer donating on the web, please visit us at www.interfaithfulness.org and look for the Donate button in the lower right corner of the page. We invite you to follow us too at our Interfaithfulness Facebook page. Thanks for joining us today at Interfaithfulness, where everything changes for the better when we move toward a more Jewish Jesus.